The strange boy who shocked doctors in 1889 became a medical mystery that would challenge everything science thought it knew about the human body. His case files, buried for decades, revealed abilities that defied explanation, even by today's standards. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The spring of 1889 brought more than just thawing ground to the Whitmore farm. As the wagon wheels ground to a halt on the muddy path, 12-year-old Daniel Whitmore surveyed his new home with unnervingly steady eyes. The journey from the Brattleboro orphanage had been long, but the boy showed no signs of fatigue or apprehension. Samuel Whitmore stepped forward first, his weathered hands extended in awkward welcome. A lifetime of tilling Vermont soil had hardened his exterior, but the farmer had agreed to take in the orphan with surprising readiness. The property, perched on a windswept ridge overlooking the valley, needed all the help it could get with planting season approaching. "Welcome to our home," Rebecca Whitmore said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She had longed for a child for years, but something about this boy's demeanor made her maternal instincts falter. Daniel clutched a faded canvas bag, apparently containing all his worldly possessions, and nodded politely. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Whitmore," he replied, his voice steady and oddly mature for a child his age. "Your farm is exactly as I imagined it would be." Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with her husband. They had sent no photographs, no descriptions of the property. The comment lingered uncomfortably in the air. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the wooden floorboards of the farmhouse kitchen, Daniel sat perfectly still at the dinner table, consuming his stew with mechanical precision. Samuel attempted conversation, describing the chores that would soon become part of the boy's daily routine. "I understand, sir," Daniel responded to each instruction. "I'm familiar with farm work." Rebecca busied herself with the dishes, stealing glances at their new ward. His pale face reflected the lamplight oddly, almost as if illuminated from within. When their eyes met, the boy smiled, a gesture that should have been reassuring, but instead sent a chill down her spine. Later that night, as the couple prepared for bed, Rebecca voiced her unease. "There's something different about him, Samuel." Her husband sighed, pulling back the quilt. "He's an orphan, Becky. Of course he's different. Life's been hard on him." "It's not that," she insisted. "It's his eyes, the way he looks at things, like he's seeing more than what's there." Samuel settled into bed, his mind already drifting toward tomorrow's labor. "We needed help with the spring planting, and the boy needed a home. The rest will sort itself out." But as Rebecca lay awake listening to the wind whistle through the eaves, she couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel Whitmore had brought something unseen with him to their isolated farm, something that would change their lives forever. Within a week of his arrival at the Whitmore farm, Daniel Whitmore had methodically worked his way through every volume on the family's modest bookshelf. Rebecca found him one evening, cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by stacks of texts he'd already consumed. Weather-worn farming almanacs, dusty theological sermons, medical journals Samuel had acquired during a brief interest in anatomy, and a tattered collection of Edgar Allan Poe's most disturbing tales. "Have you read all these?" Rebecca asked, astonishment evident in her voice. The boy nodded without looking up from the final pages of a veterinary manual. "They're quite informative," he replied in that unnervingly calm tone that had already become his signature. What truly unsettled the household came 3 days later, when Samuel's bellows, essential for his blacksmithing work, broke beyond what appeared to be repair. The farmer cursed under his breath, knowing the nearest replacement was in Rutland, nearly 2 days' journey away. Daniel appeared silently in the doorway of the workshop. "May I?" he asked, extending his small hand toward the broken tool. Samuel reluctantly surrendered the bellows, expecting nothing. The boy examined the mechanism for less than a minute before retrieving several small items from around the workshop. With movements too precise for his 12 years, He fashioned a replacement valve using materials Samuel would never have considered compatible. "Try it now," Daniel suggested. When the repaired bellows worked better than before, Samuel found himself unable to speak, watching the orphan return to the house as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Word spread quickly through the valley community. Mrs. Jenkins, stopping by with a basket of early spring vegetables, mentioned her husband's struggle with their temperamental well pump. Daniel politely interrupted her mid-sentence. "The leather gasket is worn on the north side," he said matter-of-factly. "If he replaces just that portion rather than the entire mechanism, it should function properly again." When Mr. Jenkins followed this advice and found it perfectly accurate, neighbors began arriving with increasing frequency. Daniel would answer their questions before they finished asking them, describing problems with livestock or equipment with impossible accuracy despite never having visited their properties. By the third week, the boy was reciting weather patterns with unsettling precision, predicting exactly when the late spring rains would arrive and depart, down to the hour. He described distant thunderstorms before anyone had seen lightning on the horizon. Rebecca watched these interactions with growing unease. At night, she confided to Samuel her concerns about the boy's abilities. "It isn't natural," she whispered. "No child should know these things." Samuel, still grateful for his repaired bellows and the extra help around the farm, tried to dismiss her worries. "The boy's just observant, that's all. Probably picked things up at the orphanage." But even he couldn't explain how Daniel had known exactly where to find a lost calf before anyone realized it was missing, or why the birds fell silent whenever the boy walked beneath them. Word of Daniel Whitmore's uncanny abilities spread through the narrow valley like wildfire after the spring rains. The boy had been sitting at the Whitmore's kitchen table, tracing patterns in spilled salt with his finger, when he suddenly looked up at Samuel. "The creek will rise 16 feet by tomorrow morning," he stated matter-of-factly. "Miller's Bridge won't hold." Samuel Whitmore had chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "That's quite an imagination you've got there, son." But when dawn broke the next day, the valley awoke to the thunderous crash of Miller's Bridge collapsing under the unexpected torrent. The wooden structure, which had stood for 23 years, was reduced to splinters. Remarkably, no one was hurt. The early warning from the Whitmore farm had reached enough ears that travelers had sought alternate routes. This was merely the beginning. 3 days later, Mrs. Jenkins had been fretting about a letter containing news of her sister's health in Boston. Daniel, passing by her cottage, paused at her garden gate. "The postman will bring your letter at 3 this afternoon," he said softly. "Your sister is recovering well." The elderly woman was skeptical until Thomas Green, the local postman, arrived at precisely 3, letter in hand. The correspondence indeed contained joyful news of her sister's recovery. These incidents traveled from household to household across Brattleboro. Some neighbors began appearing at the Whitmore farm with thinly veiled questions about crop rotations or weather patterns, hoping to glean predictions from the strange boy. Rebecca initially took pride in Daniel's helpfulness. She would beam as he advised Farmer Collins about a weak spot in his barn roof, or told the miller exactly when the river would provide optimal power for his wheel. His insights made the Whitmores suddenly welcome at gatherings where they had previously been merely tolerated. Yet as summer approached, Rebecca began noticing something unsettling. Sometimes while Daniel was speaking to her, his eyes would drift past her shoulder, focusing on something invisible. His smile would remain, but it seemed disconnected from his gaze. During these moments, a peculiar chill would settle over the kitchen, despite the warm hearth. "Daniel, what are you looking at?" she asked one evening as they washed dishes together. "Just listening," he replied, his voice distant. "There are so many voices if you know how to hear them." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she dried a plate. She caught Samuel's concerned glance from across the room. That night she lay awake beside her husband, remembering how the boy had known about Mrs. Jenkins' letter before it arrived, wondering what other whispers reached his ears and what they might be telling him. Samuel Whitmore sat at the worn kitchen table, quill in hand, carefully choosing his words. The letter to Dr. Edmund Hartwell was not one he wrote lightly. After 3 weeks of Daniel's uncanny predictions and inexplicable knowledge, even Samuel's practical nature couldn't dismiss what was happening under his roof. When the physician's carriage rolled up the dusty path a week later, Rebecca straightened her apron nervously. Dr. Hartwell stepped down with the careful movements of a man who had seen too much suffering. His salt-and-pepper beard framed a face weathered by years tending to the wounded during the war between the states. Those experiences had left him both skeptical and open to life's mysteries. "The boy is in the barn," Samuel explained, leading the doctor across the yard. "Been fixing things no 12-year-old should understand." Daniel Whitmore looked up from a broken harness he was mending, his eyes meeting the doctor's with unsettling directness. "You're wondering if I'm feverish or touched in the head," the boy said calmly before Hartwell could introduce himself. "I'm neither, Dr. Hartwell." The physician's medical bag nearly slipped from his fingers. "How did you know my question, or my name?" "The same way I know you still dream about the soldiers you couldn't save at Antietam," Daniel replied, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Edmund's face paled. He'd never spoken of those nightmares to anyone in Brattleboro. Inside the farmhouse, the doctor arranged his instruments on the table. His hands, once steady in battlefield surgeries, trembled slightly as he placed his stethoscope against Daniel's chest. The boy's heartbeat remained perfectly steady, neither quickening nor slowing, despite the doctor's increasingly complex tests. "Impossible," Edmund muttered, checking Daniel's temperature for the 3rd time. The mercury refused to rise above normal, even when the physician placed a warm cloth on the boy's forehead that should have affected the reading. "Your medical training doesn't account for someone like me," Daniel said, answering the unspoken thought. The doctor ran through every test in his arsenal: reflex tests, vision examinations, breathing assessments. Each yielded the same bewildering result: perfect normalcy that somehow felt profoundly abnormal in its consistency. "When I ask you questions in my mind, you answer them aloud," Edmund finally said, sitting back in his chair. "How?" "Words form in your thoughts before you speak them," Daniel explained. "I simply hear them earlier than most." As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the Whitmore kitchen, Dr. Hartwell packed away his instruments, his scientific certainty shaken to its core. He had come expecting to find a clever child, or perhaps early signs of mental disturbance. Instead, he was leaving with questions that would haunt him far more persistently than his wartime ghosts. The autumn moon cast long shadows across the wooden floorboards as Rebecca Whitmore stirred from her fitful sleep. Something had awakened her, a presence, perhaps, or simply the old farmhouse settling into the night chill. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and her heart nearly stopped when she spotted a silhouette by the window. Daniel stood motionless, his slight frame backlit by moonlight. His eyes were wide open, fixed on some distant point beyond the glass pane, beyond the rolling fields that surrounded their isolated home. "Daniel?" Rebecca whispered, pulling her woolen shawl around her shoulders as she slipped out of bed. "What are you doing up at this hour?" The boy didn't turn, didn't blink. His voice came soft but clear in the stillness. "Listening to the O'Connor twins arguing about their father's will." A chill ran down Rebecca's spine that had nothing to do with the night air. The O'Connors lived 2 miles away, across the valley and beyond the creek. Even on the clearest day, their farmhouse was barely visible from the highest point on Whitmore land. "That's impossible," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You couldn't possibly hear them from here." Daniel finally turned to face her, his expression serene in the moonlight. "Thomas thinks he deserves the eastern fields because he's been working them since he was 14. Michael believes the distribution should be equal, regardless of who worked where. Rebecca's skin prickled. The details were too specific, too intimate. She knew the O'Connor brothers. Everyone in the valley did. But these particulars of their inheritance dispute weren't common knowledge. "How do you know this?" she asked, her fingers unconsciously clutching the cross pendant at her neck. "I just listen," Daniel replied simply. "The same way I hear Samuel worrying about the Northfield's drainage when he thinks he's alone." Rebecca took an involuntary step backward. Samuel had indeed been fretting about that very issue, but only in private moments when he thought no one could hear. "You should rest," the boy added, his voice taking on an oddly adult quality. "Dr. Hartwell will be arriving early tomorrow. He's bringing a new instrument to measure my pulse." Rebecca hadn't mentioned Edmund Hartwell's planned visit, nor his intention to bring new medical equipment. The farmer's wife felt suddenly exposed, as if the walls of her home had turned to glass. "Go back to bed, Daniel," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The boy nodded and moved away from the window, padding silently across the floor. As he passed, Rebecca felt the air grow inexplicably warmer, like a summer breeze in the midst of autumn. Sleep eluded her for the remainder of the night. Every creak of the farmhouse, every whisper of wind seemed to carry meaning. Conversations she couldn't quite hear, secrets she wasn't meant to know. December brought a brutal snowstorm that howled across the Brattleboro Valley like a vengeful spirit. The Whitmore farmhouse, usually a bastion against Vermont's harsh winters, creaked and shuddered under the assault of wind and ice. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the hearth fire, which Rebecca Whitmore had carefully tended all day, suddenly sputtered and died, leaving only cold ashes where warmth had been. "Damn this weather," Samuel muttered, his calloused hands fumbling with matches in the growing darkness. The farmer struck one after another, but each flame withered before touching the kindling. Rebecca knelt beside him, arranging dry wood with practiced fingers, her breath visible in the frigid air. "We'll freeze if we can't get this lit," she whispered, pulling her shawl tighter. The couple worked frantically, aware that without fire, the night could become deadly. Outside, the wind screamed against the windows, finding every crack in the old farmhouse walls. Daniel Whitmore stood silently in the corner, watching the adults struggle. His thin frame seemed untouched by the cold that had Rebecca shivering and Samuel cursing under his breath. The boy's eyes reflected nothing as he observed their desperate efforts, his expression calm and detached. After several more failed attempts, Daniel stepped forward. "May I try?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. Samuel, frustration etched across his weathered face, nodded and moved aside. The boy approached the hearth without taking any of the tools. No matches, no kindling, nothing. He simply gazed at the cold ashes, his eyes focused on something invisible to the others. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, without warning or explanation, the dead embers began to glow. Orange light blossomed in the fireplace, growing brighter until flames erupted from seemingly nowhere, dancing across logs that moments before had been ice cold. The fire roared to life with unnatural vigor, instantly filling the room with warmth that pushed back the winter chill. The sudden heat was accompanied by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow even the howling of the storm outside. Samuel stared at the crackling flames, then at the boy, his face drained of color. The farmer, who had prided himself on his practical nature and reasoned approach to life, felt something fundamental shift inside him. His hands trembled slightly as he pocketed the useless matches. "How did you—" Rebecca began, but her words trailed off as Daniel turned toward her with that same placid expression. "It just needed encouragement," the boy said simply, as if lighting fires with his mind were the most natural thing in the world. That night, as warmth returned to the farmhouse, a different kind of chill settled over Samuel. His faith in the orderly, explainable world he had always known began to waver, replaced by questions he had no framework to answer. Visitors to the Whitmore farm began noticing something peculiar about their visits. Arguments that had been brewing on the ride over dissipated upon arrival. Worries about crops, finances, and family troubles seemed to melt away like morning fog under the summer sun. The common thread in all these instances was the presence of Daniel Whitmore. Eliza Jenkins and her husband had arrived one afternoon in a state of barely contained fury after disagreeing about selling their eastern field. Yet within minutes of Daniel quietly offering them tea in the sitting room, they found themselves calmly discussing compromise solutions they hadn't considered before. "I can't explain it," Eliza later told her sister. "It was as if someone had gently tuned my anger down like a violin string." Even Samuel noticed the change in his own temperament. The farmer, typically quick to frustration when equipment broke down, found himself oddly serene when Daniel was nearby. The boy would stand silently, watching Samuel work, and somehow the usual curses and thrown tools never materialized. The effect extended beyond humans. Rebecca observed with wonder how the usually skittish chickens would form orderly lines when the boy approached. The temperamental stallion that had thrown Samuel twice last spring now stood docile, allowing Daniel to stroke its muzzle without a single nervous twitch. "It's the strangest thing," Dr. Edmund Hartwell remarked to Rebecca during one of his increasingly frequent visits. "I've spent 30 years learning to calm patients, yet this child does it without a word." One crisp morning, as Rebecca kneaded dough in the kitchen, Daniel sat at the wooden table, methodically arranging salt and pepper shakers into patterns only he understood. "I can adjust people's feelings," he said suddenly, his voice soft but matter-of-fact. Rebecca's hands stilled in the dough. "What do you mean, Daniel?" The boy looked up, his expression serene. "Emotions are like musical notes. Some are sharp, some flat. I can tune them." He demonstrated with his fingers, as if adjusting invisible strings. "Mr. Whitmore was too sharp this morning, worried about the eastern field. I made him flatter." Rebecca felt a chill, despite the warmth of the kitchen. "And you can do this with anyone?" Daniel nodded. "Animals are easier. They don't fight back. People sometimes do, especially if they're very angry or scared." He returned to his pattern making. "Dr. Hartwell is the hardest. His mind has too many strings." That evening, Rebecca shared Daniel's confession with Samuel. Her husband listened silently, his weathered face unreadable. Finally, he sighed. Perhaps this is why the Reverend Jenkins left so quickly on Sunday. Said he couldn't remember what he'd come to discuss. They exchanged worried glances, wondering what other abilities their young ward might possess, and whether they should fear or embrace them. The telegram arrived from Boston on a Tuesday, and by Friday, the Whitmore farm had become an unlikely laboratory. Dr. Catherine Morrison stepped from the carriage first, her academic reputation preceding her like a herald. The young psychologist's eyes lit up when she first observed Daniel Whitmore, who seemed to anticipate her questions before she formed them. "You're wondering if I can read your thoughts about your sister's wedding," Daniel said softly. "She'll be very happy with Mr. Fortin, despite your concerns." Dr. Morrison's face paled. She had told no one about her sister's engagement. Dr. Marcus Webb arrived the following day, his medical bag filled with instruments designed to detect fraud. The neurologist's skepticism was a shield he wielded professionally, having built his career debunking so-called psychics throughout New England. "I assure you, Dr. Webb, your tests won't explain me," Daniel said as they shook hands, "but I welcome them nonetheless." The three physicians transformed the farmhouse's front room into an examination space. Samuel watched warily from the doorway, his weathered hands gripping the frame as the doctors conducted their tests. Rebecca busied herself in the kitchen, unable to watch what felt increasingly like a violation of something sacred. "His temperature remains precisely 98.6 degrees regardless of external conditions," Dr. Hartwell noted, recording the measurements in his journal. The physician had abandoned his earlier reservations, now fully committed to documenting the boy's abilities. The compass test proved most dramatic. When placed before Daniel, the needle spun wildly, as if caught in a magnetic storm. Dr. Webb insisted on blindfolding the boy and moving the device randomly around the room. The result remained the same. The needle oriented toward Daniel, regardless of position. "It's responding to an electromagnetic field I can't control," Daniel explained matter-of-factly. "I'm sorry it's disrupting your equipment." The sleep experiments yielded the most unsettling results. While in deep slumber, Daniel described with perfect clarity a fire breaking out in a Boston laboratory. Details confirmed 2 days later when the newspaper arrived. Dr. Morrison grew increasingly protective, placing herself between Daniel and Webb's more invasive tests. "He's a child, not a specimen," she insisted one evening. Webb merely smiled. "He's neither, Catherine. He's evolution incarnate, what humanity might become in 1,000 years." As the doctors debated late into the night, their voices carrying through the thin farmhouse walls, Daniel sat alone in his room, arranging small stones in perfect geometric patterns. He knew their theories were all partially right, yet fundamentally wrong. The truth was both simpler and far more complex than any of them could imagine. Whispers spread through Brattleboro faster than the autumn wind. At the general store, conversations would halt when the door creaked open, resuming only after confirming it wasn't Samuel Whitmore or his wife coming to purchase supplies. Daniel Whitmore had become the Valley's most discussed resident without ever setting foot in town himself. "My tomatoes doubled in size after that boy walked through my field," declared Farmer Jenkins, displaying vegetables so plump they strained against their own skin. Others nodded, recounting similar tales of abundant harvests wherever Daniel had wandered. "That ain't natural," muttered Mrs. Peterson, clutching her shawl tighter. "My Henry saw the miller's cattle form a perfect circle when the boy passed by. Just stood there, all facing inward, like they were listening to something we can't hear." Rebecca Whitmore noticed the changed atmosphere when she visited town. Women who once greeted her warmly now offered tight-lipped smiles. Their eyes filled with questions they dared not ask. The shopkeeper counted her change twice, careful not to touch her fingers. "Is it true?" whispered Sarah Blackwood, cornering Rebecca by the dry goods. "They say he knows things before they happen, that he doesn't need to eat like normal folk." Rebecca stammered a denial, but her flushed cheeks betrayed her. The truth was, she had stopped preparing a plate for Daniel weeks ago, yet the boy remained healthy, his eyes bright and alert. Church attendance swelled as townsfolk sought divine guidance. Pastor Williams delivered impassioned sermons about discerning true miracles from the devil's work, his gaze repeatedly drifting toward the Whitmore's empty pew. 3 days later, the pastor's black carriage appeared at the farmhouse. Samuel invited him in, offering coffee that the clergyman accepted with trembling hands. "I've come about your guest," Pastor Williams said, choosing his words carefully. "The congregation is concerned." Dr. Edmund Hartwell had advised the Whitmores to keep Daniel's abilities private, but secrets rarely survived in small communities. Samuel explained that Daniel was simply a bright, unusual child, nothing more. The pastor's response was to bow his head and pray, asking for protection over the household and wisdom to understand God's purpose in sending such a strange child to their valley. As he departed, Daniel appeared in the doorway, fixing the pastor with that unnervingly calm gaze. "Don't worry about Sunday's sermon," the boy said softly. "The words will come to you when you need them." Pastor Williams stumbled back to his carriage, crossing himself when he thought no one was looking. That evening, Rebecca found Daniel sitting perfectly still on the porch, watching the distant lights of town. "They're afraid of what they don't understand," he said without turning, "but soon they'll have reason to be." Rebecca Whitmore had always been a sound sleeper, but since Daniel's arrival, rest eluded her. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning as she tossed aside her quilt, resigned to another night of wandering the farmhouse. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way downstairs, hoping a warm cup of milk might coax sleep to return. A strange glow emanated from the kitchen. Rebecca paused at the doorway, her heart quickening. Daniel stood in the center of the room, illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window. The boy wasn't simply awake, he was arranging their kitchen utensils with methodical precision across the wooden table. "Daniel," she whispered, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "What are you doing up at this hour?" The orphan didn't startle at her voice. He continued placing forks, knives, and spoons in intricate patterns, his movements deliberate and precise. When he finally looked up, his eyes held that familiar faraway gaze that always unsettled her. "I'm making anchor points, Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, as though explaining something obvious. Rebecca stepped closer, transfixed by the geometric perfection of his arrangement. Spoons formed concentric circles, while knives radiated outward like sunbeams. Forks created complex lattice patterns between them. "Anchor points?" she asked, her breath visible in the suddenly chilled air. Daniel nodded, returning to his work. "They help me stay connected." His small hands adjusted a butter knife by a fraction of an inch. "I need them, though I can't explain why." The farmer's wife felt a prickling sensation on her arms that had nothing to do with the cold. The shadows on the kitchen walls seemed to deepen and pulse with each utensil Daniel placed, as though the darkness itself was breathing. "Does Samuel know about this?" she asked, trying to maintain composure. "Mr. Whitmore sleeps too deeply to notice," Daniel replied, his voice emotionless. "But you don't sleep well anymore. I'm sorry about that." Rebecca shivered, remembering Dr. Morrison's fascination with the boy's empathic abilities. The kitchen felt unnaturally cold now, despite the lingering warmth from the evening's cooking fire. "Will you tell me what these anchor points do?" she pressed gently. Daniel's hands finally stilled. He looked up at her with those impossibly old eyes in his young face. "They keep me here," he whispered. "Otherwise, I might drift away completely." Rebecca didn't understand, but something in his tone made her throat tighten with inexplicable dread. The shadows continued their rhythmic pulsing, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the roosters crow hours before dawn should have broken. She would tell Samuel about this in the morning, she decided. But as she watched Daniel resume his meticulous work, she wondered if her husband's practical mind could make any more sense of it than hers. As the first hints of spring touched the valley, Rebecca Whitmore noticed something that made her blood run cold. Daniel Whitmore hadn't touched his food in over a week. At first, she thought perhaps he was eating when she wasn't watching, sneaking bites between chores or during the night. She began to leave small marks in the bread, tiny notches in the cheese, silent witnesses to any midnight hunger. But the evidence was undeniable. The boy consumed nothing, not a morsel of food, not a drop of water. Yet his cheeks remained flushed with health, his step light as he moved through the farmhouse. If anything, he seemed more vibrant than before, as if nourished by something invisible to ordinary eyes. "Samuel," she whispered one night after Daniel had retired to his room, "have you noticed that he doesn't eat?" Her husband's weathered hands trembled slightly as he set down his cup. The farmer had indeed noticed, though he'd been reluctant to acknowledge what his eyes were telling him. "Perhaps he eats elsewhere," Samuel suggested weakly. "Maybe Mrs. Jenkins is feeding him when he visits." Rebecca shook her head. "We spoke with her yesterday. She says Daniel politely refuses everything she offers." The couple sat in uneasy silence, the crackling of the hearth the only sound between them. Once they had eagerly welcomed the orphan boy to their table, grateful for his help with farm chores, charmed by his quiet intelligence. Now they found themselves whispering about him after dark, questioning everything they thought they knew. Dr. Hartwell should be informed, Samuel finally said, his voice barely audible. The following day, Rebecca watched Edmund Hartwell arrived, his medical bag in hand. The physician examined Daniel thoroughly, checking his pulse, listening to his breathing, testing his reflexes. Everything appeared normal, extraordinarily so. "Young man," Dr. Hartwell said carefully, "Mrs. Whitmore tells me you haven't been eating." "I no longer need to," Daniel replied simply, as if discussing the weather. The doctor exchanged glances with Samuel, whose face had gone pale. Every living thing needs sustenance. Hartwell insisted. Daniel merely smiled. "I am sustained differently now." Later, after Daniel had excused himself, the three adults gathered around the kitchen table, their voices hushed despite being alone. "Is he human?" Rebecca finally asked, giving voice to the question that had haunted her for weeks. Neither man answered. The silence stretched between them, filled with implications none dared speak aloud. The morning had dawned crisp and clear when Daniel Whitmore looked up from his breakfast, a plate he hadn't touched, and announced with eerie calm, "Mr. Wilcox will clutch his chest at precisely 11:37 today. His heart will fail him by the general store steps." Rebecca dropped her spoon, the clatter breaking the silence that followed. Samuel Whitmore exchanged a worried glance with his wife before clearing his throat. "Now, Daniel, that's not something to jest about," he said firmly. The boy's eyes remained distant. "It's not a jest. I can see it happening." By midday, the news had spread through Brattleboro like wildfire. Harold Wilcox, the robust blacksmith who had never known a day's illness, had indeed collapsed at exactly 11:37, clutching his chest on the general store steps. Dr. Edmund Hartwell had been summoned immediately, but the doctor's efforts proved futile. "How could he have known?" whispered Mrs. Jenkins to her neighbor, as they watched Daniel walk past the churchyard the following day. "It's not natural, not Christian." The prediction marked a turning point. Where once the townspeople had marveled at the boy's insights, even sought them out, now they hurried inside when they saw him approaching. Mothers pulled their children close. Men tipped their hats nervously and quickened their pace. Even Thomas Green, the postmaster who had delighted in bringing letters to the Whitmore farm to chat with Daniel about faraway places, now refused to make the journey alone. "I'll need young Billy to accompany me," he told Rebecca when she inquired about a delayed package. His eyes darted nervously around the kitchen, never quite meeting hers. Dr. Catherine Morrison noticed the change during her weekly visits. "They fear what they don't understand," she explained gently to Daniel as they sat on the porch. The psychologist had grown protective of the boy, documenting his abilities while shielding him from Dr. Webb's more invasive inquiries. "I don't mean to frighten them," Daniel replied, his voice soft. "I only say what I see." Samuel found himself defending the boy less frequently at church gatherings. His shoulders hunched under the weight of sideways glances and abruptly ended conversations. Rebecca wept quietly at night, torn between her growing unease and her attachment to the strange child they had welcomed into their home. "Perhaps we should limit his interactions with others," Samuel suggested one evening, his weathered hands nervously working at a piece of wood. "And make him more of an outsider?" Rebecca countered, though her voice lacked conviction. That night, as a cold rain pelted the farmhouse windows, Daniel stood in the doorway of their bedroom, his silhouette unnervingly still. "They're right to be afraid," he said simply. "Something is coming that even I can't fully see." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Dr. Catherine Morrison placed the brass compass on the oak table with trembling fingers. She'd witnessed remarkable phenomena before: patients with multiple personalities, cases of apparent telepathy. But nothing had prepared her for what Daniel Whitmore was about to demonstrate. "I won't touch it," Daniel said softly, his eyes fixed on the small navigational instrument. Catherine nodded, her notebook open beside her. The compass needle quivered slightly, then began to rotate. slowly at first, then with increasing speed until it spun like a child's toy. Without warning, the entire compass slid across the polished surface, stopping precisely at the edge of the table. "My God," she whispered, her scientific detachment momentarily abandoned. The boy smiled, that same serene expression that both comforted and unsettled everyone at the Whitmore farm. "It's just patterns," he explained, as if discussing something as ordinary as the weather. "Everything is connected by invisible threads." Outside, Samuel Whitmore hammered iron plates to wooden beams with grim determination. The secret room was taking shape in the corner of the barn, away from prying eyes. Each strike of his hammer seemed to punctuate his growing fear. The physician from Boston might see Daniel as a scientific marvel, but Samuel saw something else, something that required containment. "The nails need to be pure iron," he muttered to himself, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool spring air. "Iron keeps things anchored." The old superstitions his grandmother had whispered about spirits and boundaries suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like survival knowledge. In the kitchen, Rebecca Whitmore kneaded bread dough with unusual force, her thoughts churning like the compass needle. She remembered praying for a child after years of disappointment, remembered how her heart had leaped when the orphanage in Boston had written about Daniel. Now that same heart felt heavy with foreboding. "I wanted this," she whispered to the empty room. "I wanted him here." The dough beneath her fingers felt cold despite the warm kitchen. Had she been so blinded by maternal longing that she'd ignored the signs? The way animals grew still when Daniel approached. The way he knew things no child should know. Dr. Morrison carefully documented the compass experiment, her handwriting unusually messy. Unlike Dr. Webb, who saw only opportunity in Daniel's abilities, Catherine felt a growing sense of responsibility. What if these powers continued to develop? What boundaries might be crossed? Samuel's hammering grew louder as the day progressed. The iron room was taking shape. A cage or a sanctuary, he wasn't sure which. All he knew was that something was gathering on the horizon, something beyond his understanding, but not beyond his fear. Rebecca shaped the bread into loaves, wondering if Daniel would even pretend to eat them tonight. The guilt weighed on her like stones. She had wanted a child. Now she wondered what exactly they had welcomed into their home. Throughout Brattleboro Valley, sleep became a doorway rather than a refuge. Townspeople tossed in their beds, their dreams invaded by the calm presence of Daniel Whitmore. Mrs. Jenkins awoke with a start one Tuesday, convinced the boy had stood at her bedside, pointing silently to the loose floorboard beneath her nightstand. The next morning, she discovered the board concealed a nest of mice that would have soon reached her winter stores. The Calloway family reported similar visitations. Their youngest daughter claimed Daniel had warned her not to ride in her father's wagon the following day. When a wheel broke on that very journey, throwing Mr. Calloway into a ditch but leaving him largely unharmed, the family lit candles in gratitude. Not all encounters left people feeling blessed. Thomas Miller, the blacksmith's son, described dreams where the strange boy simply watched him, eyes unblinking, until Thomas felt his very thoughts laid bare. He refused to sleep without a lantern burning afterward. "It's as if he's everywhere at once," Rebecca Whitmore confessed to Dr. Catherine Morrison during one of her increasingly frequent visits to the farm. The psychologist noted the dark circles under Rebecca's eyes, evidence of her fractured sleep. "Sometimes I see him standing at the foot of our bed, but when I reach for Samuel, he's already seeing the same thing." Dr. Morrison documented 17 separate accounts of dream visitations in a single week. "The phenomenon appears consistent with telepathic projection," she wrote in her journal, though her scientific training rebelled against such terminology. "The subject seems capable of manifesting his consciousness within the subconscious minds of others, primarily during REM sleep states." Samuel found himself avoiding sleep altogether, staying up late in his workshop surrounded by iron tools. "Metal grounds whatever he is, the farmer explained to Dr. Edmund Hartwell, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. When I'm surrounded by it, he doesn't come to me in dreams. The boundaries between sleeping and waking grew permeable. Mrs. Wilcox swore she saw Daniel standing in her kitchen in broad daylight, though he vanished when she blinked. The postmaster claimed the boy appeared beside him on his rounds, walking silently for nearly a mile before dissolving into the morning mist. Dr. Marcus Webb, initially skeptical, became convinced after experiencing his own nocturnal visitation. "The boy showed me equations," the neurologist reported excitedly. "Mathematical formulations that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself." Daniel, when questioned about these appearances, merely smiled. "People need to know things," he said simply. "Dreams are quieter than words." As summer deepened, no household remained untouched by his presence. Daniel had become more than a boy. He was a shared experience, a collective visitation that bound the valley together in equal measures of wonder and dread. The farmers of Brattleboro Valley first noticed the strange patterns in May. Sheep that normally scattered across hillsides began forming perfect circles when Daniel Whitmore walked by. Birds perched in geometric formations on fence posts near the Whitmore farm, their usual chaotic fluttering replaced by an eerie stillness that lasted for hours. "Just like the old stories," whispered Martha Jenkins at the general store, her voice dropping to ensure the postmaster wouldn't overhear. "My grandmother spoke of the spirit of the mountain, a being neither human nor divine that comes when the land needs healing." The tale spread quickly. Ancient folklore, nearly forgotten in the rush toward modernity, resurfaced in hushed conversations. Elders recalled stories their grandparents had told of a presence that walked between worlds, appearing as a child, but carrying ancient knowledge. Samuel tried to dismiss the rumors, his weathered hands gripping his tools more tightly as neighbors avoided his gaze at Sunday service. "Superstitious nonsense," he muttered to Rebecca as they rode home in their wagon. But even he couldn't explain why deer and foxes, natural enemies, stood peacefully together at the edge of their property, watching the farmhouse with unblinking eyes. Dr. Morrison documented these animal behaviors meticulously, filling notebook after notebook with observations. "The fauna appear to recognize something in the boy that we cannot perceive," she wrote to her colleagues in Boston. "Perhaps a frequency or energy signature beyond human detection." Those who believed Daniel to be a blessing began leaving offerings, jars of preserves, handcrafted items, even small pouches of coins, at the edge of the Whitmore property. "For the spirit's favor," read one note attached to a carefully knitted blanket. Others saw only darkness in these manifestations. Pastor Williams spoke carefully of testing the spirits during his sermon, eyes fixed on the Whitmore's empty pew. 3 families on the eastern ridge packed their belongings and moved to relatives in New Hampshire, claiming the air itself felt wrong when the wind blew from the direction of the farm. Rebecca found herself increasingly isolated. Women who once shared recipes and gossip now crossed the street when they saw her approaching. The farmhouse that had hosted community gatherings and harvest celebrations stood silent. Its occupants avoided like carriers of some invisible contagion. "They say he speaks to the mountain at night," the blacksmith told Dr. Hartwell during an examination for his arthritis. "My son saw him standing on that ridge behind your place, arms outstretched, with foxfire dancing all around him." The physician merely nodded, no longer certain where science ended and something else began. By midsummer, the Whitmore farm had become a place of pilgrimage for some, a forbidden zone for others, a focal point for the community's deepest hopes and darkest fears, with Daniel at its center, watching it all with those calm, knowing eyes. The barn had been transformed into an impromptu laboratory. Dr. Edmund Hartwell meticulously arranged his instruments on a wooden table, while Dr. Catherine Morrison reviewed her notes. Dr. Marcus Webb paced impatiently. checking his pocket watch every few minutes. Daniel Whitmore sat calmly in the center of a chalk circle they had drawn on the floor. The boy's serene expression betrayed nothing of the extraordinary circumstances. Samuel and Rebecca Whitmore watched nervously from the doorway, the farmer's hand protectively on his wife's shoulder. "We'll begin with simple observations," Dr. Hartwell announced, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "Daniel, are you comfortable?" The boy nodded, his eyes focused on something distant. "The experiment will work," he said softly, "but not in the way you expect." Catherine approached with her notebook. "We're measuring temperature variations, visual phenomena, and any electromagnetic disturbances," she explained to the Whitmores. "Nothing invasive." Webb positioned his compass nearby. Previous tests showed significant needle deflection when Daniel. Catherine corrected firmly. "When Daniel concentrates," Webb finished, adjusting his spectacles. The physicians formed a triangle around the boy, each with different instruments. Rebecca clutched her husband's arm as the air in the barn seemed to thicken, carrying the faint scent of ozone that now accompanied Daniel's demonstrations. "I'm going to count backward from 10, Hartwell instructed. "Focus your attention on remaining visible to us." Daniel smiled. "That's not how it works, doctor." Before anyone could respond, the boy began to fade. Not gradually as one might expect, but in patches. First his hands, then portions of his torso, finally his face, until only empty space remained within the chalk circle. "Good God," Samuel whispered, crossing himself. "Daniel?" Rebecca called, her voice trembling. "I'm still here," came the boy's voice, seemingly from everywhere at once. The compass spun wildly, its needle whirling like a weather vane in a hurricane. Hartwell reached tentatively into the empty space. Extraordinary, extra-dimensional transference, perhaps. A separation of consciousness from physical form. Webb's scientific skepticism crumbled as he frantically scribbled notes. "This changes everything," he muttered. "The implications for human evolution, for science itself." Only Catherine remained still, tears streaming silently down her face. She alone seemed to understand what the others couldn't yet grasp, that Daniel was slipping away, becoming something they could no longer reach or comprehend. "Can you return to us?" she asked softly. After a long pause, Daniel's form gradually reappeared, though somehow less substantial than before, as if he were partially elsewhere, even when visible. "Not for much longer," he answered, his voice echoing strangely. "Soon I'll go where you can't follow." The summer of 1890 brought an eerie stillness to the valley surrounding Brattleboro. As fireflies danced outside windows, Daniel Whitmore began appearing in homes throughout the community, materializing without warning or explanation. The Johnsons were the first to report his midnight visit, the boy simply standing at the foot of their bed, his eyes reflecting moonlight that shouldn't have reached that corner of the room. "He didn't speak," Martha Johnson told Rebecca Whitmore at the general store, her hands trembling as she clutched her basket. "Just watched us with those calm eyes of his. When my husband reached for the lamp, the boy was gone, but that strange smell remained, like the air after lightning strikes. Within a week, 3 more families reported similar visitations. The Pattersons claimed Daniel appeared in their kitchen, arranging silverware into the same intricate patterns Rebecca had witnessed months earlier. The boy vanished when addressed, leaving behind only the geometric design and the distinctive scent of ozone. Dr. Edmund Hartwell documented each incident meticulously, noting the consistency in details across households that had no contact with one another. The physician's scientific curiosity battled with growing unease as reports continued to accumulate on his desk. "I believe we're witnessing something unprecedented," he confided to Dr. Catherine Morrison during one of their increasingly frequent consultations. "The boy seems to be testing boundaries, not just physical ones." The psychologist nodded gravely. "Whatever Daniel is becoming, I fear we cannot contain it much longer." Panic spread through the valley like wildfire. The Millers packed their wagon and fled to relatives in Massachusetts. 2 more families followed, boarding up windows and doors, as if such measures could keep out a presence that seemed to move between the fabric of reality itself. Samuel Whitmore reinforced the iron room he'd constructed, working late into the night as Rebecca watched Daniel from the kitchen doorway. The boy continued his daily routines with serene detachment, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about the fear rippling through the community. "Are you visiting people at night?" she finally asked him directly. Daniel looked up from the book he wasn't reading. His eyes had remained fixed on the same page for over an hour. "I'm learning how to exist in different ways," he replied simply. "Sometimes I forget which way is the right one." That night, Reverend Collins organized a prayer vigil at the local church. Half the town attended, clutching Bibles and candles against the summer darkness, whispering about angels and demons while casting nervous glances toward the Whitmore farm on the distant ridge. Dr. Marcus Webb alone seemed energized by the developments, furiously documenting everything in his journal. "We're witnessing evolution," he wrote, "the next stage of human potential manifesting before our very eyes." The Boston Herald's front page blared with speculation about the Vermont wonder child. Dr. Marcus Webb had anonymously sent a detailed account of Daniel Whitmore's abilities to 3 major newspapers, carefully omitting the Whitmore farm's exact location. Within days, letters flooded the Brattleboro post office, addressed simply to "the family of the extraordinary boy." Samuel Whitmore burned most of these missives without opening them. Those he did read filled him with dread. Prestigious universities offering substantial sums for exclusive access, pharmaceutical companies requesting biological samples, even a telegram from a wealthy industrialist proposing to fund a private research institute with Daniel at its center. "They speak of him like he's a specimen," Rebecca whispered one evening, her hands trembling as she sorted through the day's mail. "Not a child at all." Meanwhile, Dr. Catherine Morrison sequestered herself in her Boston office, poring over obscure medical texts. The psychologist had begun researching sedatives and experimental treatments that might dampen Daniel's abilities without harming him. Her colleagues at the university noted her sudden interest in the emerging field of electromagnetic therapy, though none connected it to the strange reports from Vermont. "I'm trying to protect him," she explained to Dr. Edmund Hartwell during their tense meeting at a quiet cafe. "If the wrong people reach him first." The physician nodded gravely. "Webb has gone too far. He's positioning himself as Daniel's interpreter to the scientific community." Catherine's voice dropped to a whisper. "And what if Daniel doesn't want to be interpreted? What if his abilities are meant for something we can't understand?" 2 men in dark suits appeared in Brattleboro that week, asking pointed questions at the general store. They claimed to represent a scientific foundation, but their military bearing betrayed different origins. When they approached the Whitmore property, they found Samuel waiting at the gate, shotgun resting casually across his arms. "Government men, are you?" he asked, his weathered face impassive. "Daniel said you'd be coming. Said to tell you that some doors aren't meant to be opened by force." The men departed without argument, but Samuel knew they wouldn't be the last. That night, Dr. Morrison wrote in her journal, "The boy exists at the intersection of science and the soul. If we rush to dissect this miracle, we may destroy it, and perhaps ourselves in the process. I fear we are not ready for what Daniel represents." In Boston, Dr. Webb received an invitation to present his findings to a private consortium of wealthy patrons. He packed his notes carefully, unaware that the geometric symbols Daniel had drawn now appeared in his own handwriting throughout the margins. As the leaves began to turn in early September of 1890, Daniel Whitmore's transformation accelerated. His once fluid speech became fragmented, words escaping his lips like reluctant visitors. Rebecca Whitmore noticed how his movements had slowed, as if he were walking through invisible honey. The boy who had once darted through the farmhouse with boundless energy now drifted like a ghost. In the weathered barn, Daniel spent hours, sometimes entire days, meticulously tracing intricate symbols across the wooden floor with a piece of chalk. Concentric circles, spiraling patterns, and angular formations that resembled no language Samuel had ever seen. The farmer watched from the doorway, clutching his iron hammer as if it might somehow anchor reality. "The patterns help me stay," Daniel explained one evening, his voice barely audible above the chirping crickets. "They're doors and windows at the same time." The air around the boy seemed charged with electricity. Animals refused to enter the barn, and metal tools vibrated slightly when placed near his drawings. Dr. Catherine Morrison, making her final visit, measured the temperature around Daniel's symbols and found it inexplicably cooler, though no draft could be detected. "I've documented everything," the psychologist told Rebecca privately, her notebook filled with observations. "But science has no framework for this. We're witnessing something beyond our understanding." Rebecca grew desperate as Daniel retreated further into silence. One night, she found him sitting motionless in the kitchen, staring at the geometric arrangement of spoons and forks he had created on the table. "Please talk to me," she begged, reaching for his hand. "We can help you stay if that's what you want." Daniel turned to her with eyes that seemed to contain galaxies. His smile, infinitely sad yet serene, broke her heart. "I was never meant to stay," he whispered. "I was only meant to show what's possible." Samuel, meanwhile, spent his evenings in prayer, surrounded by the iron tools he believed might somehow keep Daniel tethered to their world. The secret room he had built remained unused. Daniel had never shown interest in entering it. Dr. Edmund Hartwell made one last examination, his medical training utterly useless against the boy's condition. "His pulse is steady, but it follows no rhythm I recognize," he admitted to Samuel. "It's as if his heart beats to a different time altogether." On the night of September 14th, a strange aurora danced above the Whitmore farm, though no such phenomenon was reported elsewhere in Vermont. The livestock huddled together in perfect circles, and every timepiece in the house stopped at precisely midnight. Rebecca woke to find Daniel standing at her bedside, his form slightly transparent in the moonlight. "Thank you," he said simply, touching her cheek with fingers that felt like a cool breeze, "for showing me kindness." By morning, they would discover he was gone. The morning of September 15th, 1890, began like any other on the Whitmore farm. Rebecca Whitmore rose with the sun, her hands already reaching for the worn apron that had become her armor against uncertainty. When she approached Daniel's room, the door stood ajar, unusual for the methodical boy. "Daniel," she called, her voice barely a whisper. The bed was made with military precision, but Daniel Whitmore was gone. Rebecca's heart quickened as she searched the farmhouse, then the barn, then the fields beyond. No footprints marked the dew-covered grass. No gate had been opened. The boy had simply vanished. Samuel emerged from the tool shed, his face lined with a mixture of relief and dread when Rebecca delivered the news. "Perhaps it's for the best," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed the hollow feeling spreading through his chest. By midday, Dr. Edmund Hartwell arrived, summoned by Rebecca's frantic note. The physician moved through the farmhouse with practiced calm, but even his scientific mind faltered when he entered Daniel's room. The walls were covered with intricate geometric patterns, circles intersecting triangles, spirals connecting to straight lines, drawn with such precision they seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. "These match the arrangements he made with the kitchen utensils," Rebecca explained, her fingers tracing the air above one particularly complex design. Catherine Morrison arrived the following day, her journey from Boston hastened by concern. The psychologist spent hours documenting the symbols, her notebook filling with sketches and theories. "These aren't random," she insisted. "They form a language, or perhaps a map." Dr. Marcus Webb was the last to arrive, his skepticism finally giving way to genuine wonder as he examined the geometric patterns. The boy wasn't just predicting the future, he concluded. He was preparing for it. Within weeks, the Whitmores could no longer bear the emptiness Daniel had left behind. They abandoned the farm, moving to Rebecca's sister's home in Massachusetts. The farmhouse stood empty, a silent monument to something beyond understanding. The valley never forgot. Stories spread across generations of a strange boy who knew things no child should know, who moved objects without touching them, who disappeared without a trace. Some claimed to see Daniel on misty mornings, standing at the edge of forests. Others reported dreams where he spoke of worlds beyond our own. Dr. Morrison published her findings in a small scientific journal, but few believed her account. Dr. Hartwell never practiced medicine again, devoting his remaining years to studying the boundary between science and the inexplicable. Only Dr. Webb achieved recognition, though he never again mentioned the boy who had shown him the limits of human knowledge. The legend of Daniel Whitmore endured, not as a ghost story, but as a question mark in the margins of history, a reminder that some mysteries remain gloriously, terrifyingly unsolved.